thank you for the invitation to be here, and happy birthday, your 30th year. So I think that as we saw the results yesterday, and I think they were largely in line with the expectations. While we did see an increase on the right, we also see a large central area. So what I think will, and we still have to wait some time before seeing how various groupings may develop and situations may change, but I think right now what I see the main priorities staying, but with some nuances and some emphasis changing.
Maybe less red tape, a little bit more pro-business
indeed, and I think
alternatives.
And some of that in terms of regulation is to be honest needed, but I think in terms of the priorities that I would say, first of all, I would say climate would stay very much strong, although there will be some nuances and some adjustments in terms of how we go about achieving the targets. But I think certainly from the insurance industry, we remain very much focused on achieving a net zero by 2050. And I think we really hope that there is also an increased focus on resilience and adaptation, because I think that's also key. So we need to do both, reduce the levels of emissions, but we also need to prepare for the changes that we see happening already. And we see that evidence of that all the time. I think what we will see a much bigger focus on Europe's autonomy and strength, and a recognition that, especially depending on how elections go around the world in America, I think we may see an increased recognition that Europe needs to be able to stand on its own feet. And I think that covers a whole range of areas. I mean, defense is obviously talked about as one of them, but of course we have the digital transformation and digital and technology. We need to be very strong on that. We have, of course, general industry, we have energy, we have food, and I think on all of those areas, of course, it needs investment, and there insurers can play a role. It also needs innovation, and there insurers can play a role on the underwriting side. So I think we'll see more of that, and even a bigger focus on that with the current Parliament and Commission. I think that leads then to another area where I certainly hope there'll be a big emphasis, and we're seeing some signs of that, and that's on protection gaps. And we heard already in the speeches this morning the importance of that, and I certainly hope that there will be a focus on all types of protection gaps, but climate being one of them, but also pensions due to demographics, the cyber protection gap, which is increasingly important but also very challenging, and the health protection gap. And these are all very large gaps, and unfortunately they're growing. But the insurance industry can play a role. But we can't solve all that by ourselves. So we will need governments to step in. But I think with a new political horizon, I think there will be a very large recognition that you really need private investment. You can't rely just on state investment. And there again, insurers can play a role. And I think that leads me then to the last two priorities that I think link into achieving all of those other areas. And one of those is the CMU, the Capital Markets Union. I think for that, if I describe that as a project to really try to encourage private investment and then have that investment flowing into these investment needs that Europe so much requires. And again, insurers can play a large role. I think EIOPA has estimated that insurers have about 70% of the savings market at the moment, and I think it's a matter of making sure that works. We heard about the barriers. Right now it is a very heavy process to buy products. I think there's 14 pages of questions to get through and 100 data points that customers are given. We need to find a way to simplify that, while of course making sure there's value for money and customers are appropriately protected. And I think the CMU project has a real chance of doing that. And then I think the final element of all that is the regulation issue. And I really think that we need to achieve the 25% reduction that the Commission has promised, and we'll follow up on that. But we also need to, I think, improve the way we do regulation. And I think the political environment is open to that. And that doesn't mean not regulating. I think Europe has very high standards of living, very high standards of protection. We need to protect that, but we need to do that in a smarter way. So less overlaps, less excessive, maybe less ambition in some areas. I think we mentioned before the importance of the protection gaps, and I think it's pension is a very important one, which I think with the focus on climate, sometimes pension and the fact that there is an aging process, and as Petra pointed out, the old model of pay-as-you-go is really not going to work in the future. So I think really we need to move to a situation where people are putting money into their own pension. But I think that doesn't have to be a simple defined contribution, or it can be also with defined contribution with some guarantees, with some smoothing, with some pooling, so that some of that risk is taken away from the individual. Because we see that when we've surveyed 16,000 people across Europe, across many countries, I think 12 countries, the number one concern was the protection of their money. Because although on average the stock market keeps going up, for an individual person they may experience the unlucky period where it goes down, and for most people they can't afford that risk. So insurers can play a role in providing some downside protection, but still some access to an increase in the value of the money over time. And I think that's something that we need to do more about. Now, a big part of closing the gap is about education, about giving dashboards so that people can see how much they need to save, how much they are saving across the different sources of their retirement income. And I think that's part of it. But I think, and regulation will play a part. So I mentioned before about making the process easier to buy products. Solvency II plays a part, because those guarantees, mustn't make them too expensive, more expensive than they need to be. But it's also worth thinking about the way regulation can affect some other types of gaps. For example, the climate gap. I think it's really important to make sure, again, the regulation is right. Because we hear, for example, particularly in America, that there are some markets where insurers are leaving, and California is one of those. But the main reason why they're leaving in California is not just because of the very high levels of claims and losses, it's because they have price controls in California. So the insurers cannot adjust their prices to meet the actual costs. So they have no choice but to exit. And I think that's why it's very important that insurance can continue to be a risk-based approach. That means the insurers will stay in the market. That obviously, steps have to be taken to try to reduce those costs through the resilience and adaptation measures, but that will allow them to stay in the market. But also that gives the risk-based pricing gives a very important price signal to people so that they change their behavior and they don't rebuild in floodplains, and they worry about how to reduce the risk of fires and how they can stop the spreading of fires and floods. So I think these are all things that need to be taken into account in tackling the protection gap. I'd say there's a number of reasons why we can be optimistic. I think the first thing is that insurance has never been more important, both protection and savings. We just heard there's a huge gap, so that's a huge opportunity. Only 25% of natural catastrophes are protected. There's a huge savings gap, so there's a massive opportunity for growth. I think insurers, back in the old days, were one of the first to adopt new technology. Insurers were using sophisticated computer modeling before almost anyone else. So I think we need to regain that old habit and really take advantage of technology, and that opens yet another positive opportunity. So I'm optimistic.